Hey there, tonight we're going back, not to castles and kings, but to the edges of history, the part that doesn't make it into paintings. We're talking about medieval peasants, the ones who didn't ride horses or wear crowns, who survived plagues, hunger, cold, and 100 small indignities, all without a title to their name. No glory, no legacy, just long days, short nights, and a quiet kind of strength most of us wouldn't last a day in. If this kind of calm, slow history helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It's always strangely comforting to see who's out there falling asleep to the same quiet story. So dim the lights, turn on a fan if you like that soft background hum, settle in, and let's begin. At the edge of the map, this village doesn't have a name, or if it did, no one remembers it. It sits in a shallow valley, somewhere in the vague middle of nowhere, a soft crease in the land, just distant enough to avoid roads, records, or royal attention. You wouldn't find it on a map if you had a map, which you don't. You've never even seen one. Here, the world ends where the trees begin. The forest is thick and slow-moving, like something ancient that's only barely tolerating your presence. The fields stretch outward in irregular patches of green and brown, worked until exhaustion, then work some more. Somewhere to the north is a river. You've never seen it, but you've heard it mentioned in the same tone one might speak of dragons or saints. This is where you were born and where you'll die, maybe 60 steps from one to the other. The homes are rough and slumped, as if the wind has pushed against them too many winters in a row. The walls are wattle and daub, that is mud, straw, and sticks, carefully woven together and patched endlessly with whatever the weather hasn't taken yet. Roofs are thatched, and they sag under their own weight, always leaking in places you can't quite reach. The village smells like wet wool, smoke, and earth, a sour edge of livestock, a trace of damp rot. None of it surprises you anymore. It's the smell of living here. The road leading in is not really a road, just a muddy track where ox carts have worn a pair of grooves deep enough to collect rainwater and mosquitoes. No one important has traveled it in years, perhaps ever. Most days pass quietly. A distant bell marks the hours from a chapel in another village, if the wind carries the sound. Otherwise, you measure time by the position of the sun, or the depth of the shadows across the field, or the ache that settles into your spine before noon. There are maybe a dozen families here, enough to fill a small gathering on feast days. Everyone knows everyone. Everyone knows everyone's problems, and everyone politely ignores them until it's necessary not to. The village elder, if you can call him that, is a man named Tom, who once spoke to a monk and now repeats that conversation as proof of his wisdom. No one questions it. Tom's hut hasn't collapsed. His goat seems healthy. That's as close to leadership as anyone requires. Nothing here is precise. There are no written records, no deeds, no land surveys. Boundaries are understood in terms of past the old elm, or where the ground gets soft. If there's a dispute, it's handled with a shrug, a short argument, and sometimes a loaf of bread passed back and forth until no one wants to keep fighting. There's no school, no tavern, no inn. If a stranger arrives, it's discussed for weeks. Where did they come from? What do they want? Are they cursed? Do they smell of salt? The arrival of someone new is both fascinating and mildly terrifying. And no one leaves, not really. The idea of travel is less a plan than a rumor. You've heard of towns, of cities, of places where stone buildings stretch 2 or even 3 stories high. But those are stories, like talking animals or women who turn into birds. You can't miss a world you've never seen. The forest is dense, the hills are long, the roads, if they exist, are known more for bandits and bad luck than any promise of arrival. What would you do, even if you reached one of those distant places? You don't speak any other dialect. You don't carry coin. You don't know the customs. You don't even know how old you are. So you stay. There's safety in the familiar, even if it's hard, even if it's dull, even if the roof leaks and the well runs low and the same stew has been bubbling in the pot for 3 days. There's comfort in routine, in knowing where the firewood is, in knowing who to ask when your fence collapses, in knowing which patch of sky tells you when to bring in the sheep. You wake with the light, you sleep when it fades, you work in between. It isn't much, but it's life, and somehow, in the quiet rhythm of it all, there's a kind of peace, a kind that doesn't ask questions, that doesn't need to understand anything beyond what's visible from the top of the nearest hill. You might hear, once in a while, about a war, or a king dying, or a comet in the sky that scared a village 5 days' walk from here, but the news never seems to reach you directly. Just stories, passed through too many mouths to carry weight. They lose their urgency somewhere between the merchant and the shepherd's cousin. Even time feels different here. Seasons don't shift cleanly, they bleed into each other. A damp spring becomes a wet summer. A hard frost turns into the kind of winter that chews through your boots. You don't count years, you count harvests, dry ones, wet ones. The bad one when the rye grew black with rot. The good one where the barley came in thick and heavy, and even old Marjorie smiled for a week. His steward does come by. He collects grain, asks questions, writes things down. You answer carefully, never with too much detail. He doesn't seem to like detail. You've never met the king. You're not entirely sure what he does, but you know his name, and you say it when you pray, just in case it matters. Because here, on the edge of the map, most things don't change, and when they do, it's usually for the worse. Still, the half glows. The roof mostly holds, the cottage is warm, and tomorrow, the same sun will rise over the same hills, and for now, that's enough. In your lifetime, you'll walk hundreds of miles, but almost all of them will be in circles. Most people in the medieval countryside never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born, not because they lacked curiosity or energy or boots, though boots were often a luxury, but because the world beyond the next hill didn't really belong to them, and the idea of going to find it felt as far-fetched as flying. You grew up learning the names of every patch of land between your home and the edge of the field. You knew the shape of every tree stump on the path to the well. You could tell who had walked the road by the depth of their footprints in the mud. Everything beyond that started to feel theoretical. The next village over might only be 5 miles away, but it may as well have been a foreign country. You'd heard stories about it. Who married who stole a goat, who said the priest snored during Mass. But you hadn't seen it, and you likely wouldn't, because travel was dangerous. Not in the fun, thrilling way, but in the quiet, exhausting, possibly fatal kind of way. Roads weren't well-kept paths lined with signs and travelers' inns. They were mostly muddy tracks through forests, fields, and long stretches of very empty, very silent land. No maps, no directions, just vague advice like, go until you see the leaning pine tree, then left past a stone that looks like a sleeping pig. And on those paths, there were things to worry about. First, the forest. Medieval forests weren't parks. They weren't romantic. They were dense, dark, tangled with roots, and filled with noises you couldn't always identify. Boars, wolves, people who didn't want to be found. If you weren't born into the woods, they didn't want you in them. Second, bandits, people with nothing to lose and no land to till. Travelers were vulnerable, especially if they looked even vaguely well-fed. A man walking with purpose might be assumed to have coin. A woman might be traveling alone because she had something worth stealing. You learned quickly that confidence wasn't armor. Third, getting lost. This wasn't a minor inconvenience. If you wandered off track, there was no one coming to find you. You couldn't follow a river downstream and hope for the best. You could go days without seeing another soul. Your body could disappear into the bracken like smoke. People wouldn't know you were missing until the next feast day, when someone finally asked about you, and someone else just shrugged. Then there were the practical concerns. If you traveled too far, who would tend your field? Who would feed the animals? What if the Lord Steward came by to collect a tax while you were gone? You couldn't explain absence to a man holding a ledger. Your duties didn't pause just because you were curious about what lay beyond the horizon. And even if you did make it to another village, what then? You weren't expected. You weren't welcomed. Outsiders brought problems, disease, crime, strange ideas. You spoke a slightly different dialect, used different phrases, maybe even held your spoon differently. You could be met with suspicion, or worse. Hospitality wasn't universal. Food was scarce, and beds were already full. The safest place was home, not because it was particularly safe, but because it was familiar. You knew which part of the roof leaked, which chickens wandered too far, which neighbor might lend you a tool without asking too many questions. Out there, no one owed you anything. Still, people did travel sometimes, not peasants, usually, but merchants, monks, messengers, people with protection or a purpose or both. You might see them once or twice a year, coming through with carts full of wool or salted fish, trailing stories behind them like campfire smoke. They spoke of cities where buildings were made of stone and shops sold spices, and people walked streets that didn't turn to soup every time it rained. It sounded impossible. You listened, but you didn't dream too hard, because even if it were true, what would you do in a place like that? You couldn't read. You didn't own coin. You wouldn't know which customs were expected. The city could swallow you whole, and no one would even know your name. So you stayed, not because you were afraid, though sometimes you were, but because you had things to tend, a fence to mend, a niece to watch over, a bit of barley to dry, and a dozen other tasks that all needed doing before the sun dipped below the tree line. And because, truthfully, you didn't need the world to be bigger than it was. The village was enough. It had gossip and conflict and weather and sickness and fleeting joys. It had the rhythm of bells and the turning of seasons and the quiet pride of surviving another day. Sometimes, you dreamed of seeing what was beyond the woods, but most days, you just hoped the stew wouldn't burn while you fetched water. Some people did leave, usually the desperate or the reckless, sometimes the ambitious. A young man might set out in search of work or adventure or a cause worth dying for. He might come back with a limp or a story, or not at all. And when he didn't return, no one said much, just shook their heads and said he went beyond the trees, as if that explained everything. Maybe it did. For those who stayed, life was small, but it was also known. You weren't lonely exactly. You shared your days with family, neighbors, animals, and the land itself. There was comfort in repetition, comfort in the familiar complaints. You didn't need to see a distant city to understand the value of warmth, or taste cinnamon to know the joy of sweet bread, or cross a kingdom to feel love, or sorrow, or boredom, or hope. And as the years wore on and the aches settled deeper into your joints and the children grew taller than the fence posts, the idea of travel faded, not with regret, but with understanding. Some people were meant to move. You were meant to stay. There's no blueprint, no architect, no pile of neatly labeled lumber waiting to be assembled. Just mud and wood and whatever else the landscape hasn't already claimed. Your home isn't a house, not in the way most people think of one. It's more like a compromise between shelter and weather, between effort and decay, between what you needed and what the land reluctantly agreed to give you. You begin with a frame, rough-hewn timbers from the nearest trees, cut with tools that have passed through more hands than you can count. The wood isn't straight. It bends a little, it warps, but you don't mind, neither are your walls. Once the frame is up, you weave thin branches or flexible sticks between the posts, a process called wattle. It's not elegant. It's not even particularly quick, but it holds together, for the most part, like the rest of your life. Then comes the daub, a mix of mud, straw, manure, and water. You slap it on by hand. You press it between the gaps. You smooth it just enough to keep the wind out and pretend it's deliberate. It dries slowly, cracking in the sun, occasionally falling off in clumps that need to be redone before winter. You get used to the smell eventually. You stop noticing it. The roof is thatch, layers of dried straw packed tightly together and tied to the beams. When it's fresh, it's golden, almost pretty. Then the rains come. Then the birds come. Then time comes. The color fades, the edges fray. Holes appear where you never expected them, and you start placing buckets in places you hoped you'd never have to. You don't shingle it. You don't waterproof it. You just keep patching it until the whole thing threatens to become more patch than roof. At some point, you wonder if it might be easier to live under a cart. The floor is dirt. You tell yourself it's packed firm, and it is. Sort of. Years of walking, sweeping, spilling, and stomping have turned it into something almost solid. But when it rains, it softens again. When it freezes, it cracks. When the goats come in for the night, it's anyone's guess what's actually underfoot. You might spread rushes or straw to cover it. It helps a little, but soon the straw gets damp, gets dirty, gets walked into dust. Then you sweep it out and start over, or you don't. Eventually, the straw becomes the floor, and you accept it as part of the landscape. Windows, technically, openings in a wall anyway, are covered with wooden shutters that swing awkwardly and never quite close flush. Glass is too expensive, too rare, too fragile. So the wind comes in, the cold comes in, the sounds of the animals outside come in, and sometimes the animals themselves. There's a single door, usually hung a little crooked because the frame shifted during the last frost. It latches with a hook or a wooden peg, not for security. There's nothing to steal, but to keep the chickens from wandering out and the wind from wandering in. Inside, the layout is best described as shared. One room, maybe two if someone managed to tack on a lean-to or a loft, but usually just one, where you sleep, eat, cook, mend, talk, argue, and hope. Everyone lives here, parents, children, a cousin or two, a grandparent, maybe a neighbor's child whose parents are sick or gone or both. There's a hearth in the center, built of stone if you're lucky, clay if you're not. The smoke rises through a hole in the roof, more or less. There's no chimney. The air inside is always smoky, always a little warm, a little damp, and always carrying the quiet scent of stew that's been reheated one too many times. Furniture is limited. A table, a bench, maybe a stool, a chest if someone in your family was unusually good at carving or very lucky in marriage. Beds are wooden frames stuffed with straw or feathers, often shared, usually squeaking. Blankets are wool, heavy, rough, never quite dry. There's storage in the rafters, garlic, onions, herbs, maybe a small ham if the pig was kind that year. You can smell the difference between early winter and late spring just by the air above your head. Sometimes it's comforting. Sometimes it's a reminder of how close you are to running out. Animals are part of the household, literally. The cow might sleep in the same room, off in the corner. Chickens, too. A goat. It isn't ideal. It isn't sanitary, but it's warm. You learn to tune out the clucks and the shuffles and the occasional startled bleat in the middle of the night. They're part of the background noise, like wind in the thatch or the slow, settling creak of the walls. Nothing is level. The floor dips, the roof slants, the walls bulge slightly, like the whole place is breathing in and out with the seasons. You fix what you can. You ignore what you can't. Every spring, you swear you'll repair the back wall. Every autumn, it's still leaning. It's not a house built to last. It's a house built to get through the next storm. And yet, for all its flaws, and there are many, it's home. You know where the cold comes in and how to block it with an old sack. You know which roof beam you can hang the pot from and which one creaks when someone stands too close. You know how the light falls through the slats in the afternoon and where the dog curls up to sleep. When strangers pass through, they see poverty. You see effort, reuse, resourcefulness. A roof that hasn't yet collapsed is a victory. A fire that still burns at dawn is a blessing. A dry corner is worth more than gold. And when you lie down at the end of the day, surrounded by snores and silence and smoke and straw, you feel a strange kind of comfort. Not pride, exactly, but presence. This is your space. It bends, it leaks, it shifts in the wind, but it's held, and so have you. For the average medieval peasant, food was not an experience. It wasn't colorful or diverse or even all that warm. It was closer to a daily problem that had to be solved again and again, using the same pieces and the same tired hope that something edible might come of it. Your kitchen, if you could call it that, was a corner of your single-room home near the hearth. There was no pantry, no shelves lined with ingredients, no carefully hung herbs in a sunny window. There was just a pot, a fire, and short list of things you hoped hadn't spoiled. At the center of nearly every meal was pottage, a kind of eternal stew that lived in the pot and never fully stopped cooking. It was never entirely new and never entirely gone. You added to it during the day. You skimmed it at night. You kept it warm through the seasons and prayed nothing strange grew in it when your back was turned. The ingredients depended on what you had, which usually wasn't much. On a good day, pottage might include cabbage, leeks, barley, and a few legumes, maybe garlic or onions if the harvest had been kind. If it was winter, you used dried beans or peas. If you were especially lucky, a scrap of salted pork might get tossed in. More often, it was just a bone. Even that was valuable. You could boil a single bone for days, hoping it would remember what meat tasted like. The flavor profile was consistent, earthy, gray, more temperature than taste. You didn't eat pottage for the joy of it. You ate it because it was what you had. A warm meal at the end of the day was more than comfort. It was a small victory. The pot itself never really got clean. It was wiped down, sometimes scraped, but rarely scrubbed. The next batch always absorbed the ghosts of the last one. There was no spice to cover it, no vinegar to brighten it, just a slow, dependable dullness, a taste like boiled history. Bread was the other major player, not soft or golden or inviting, but hard, dense, and dark. It was usually made from rye, barley, or oats. Wheat, the soft white kind, was for the upper classes. Peasants could barely afford to see it, let alone bake with it. The loaves were small and heavy. They didn't rise much. They crumbled quickly. If you left them out for a day, they could probably double as a weapon, but they filled the stomach and gave you something to soak in your stew. Sometimes the bread was made from questionable flours, chaff, ground-up peas, or whatever was left at the bottom of the miller's barrel. In hard times, people used bark, not metaphorically. They literally ground up the inner layer of tree bark and mixed it with what little flour they had. The result was famine bread, bitter, dense, and barely digestible. It kept you alive, technically. On days when even flour was scarce, people used trenchers, slices of old bread used as plates. These soaked up stew and were either eaten at the end of the meal or thrown to the animals. Sometimes they were passed down the table to someone of lower status. Bread hierarchy at its finest. Protein was rare, very rare. Chickens laid eggs. Cows gave milk. You didn't eat your livestock unless you had no other choice. When you did, you used every part. Meat, fat, organs, bones. The blood was used for puddings. The fat was rendered. The head might become soup. Nothing was wasted. Pork was the most common meat when it was available. Pigs were efficient, and their salted fat flavored many dishes, often turning something barely edible into something vaguely pleasant. But pigs were slaughtered only when necessary. A whole pig meant weeks of planning, salting, hanging, boiling, and storing. Fishing was an option if you lived near water, but even that came with restrictions. Many rivers and lakes were controlled by lords, and fishing without permission could earn you a fine or worse. When you did fish, it was for eels, small river fish, or anything that wouldn't immediately rot. Salted herring, if you could get it, was a prize. The church dictated a fair bit of your diet, too. On Fridays and during Lent, meat was forbidden, so you pivoted to fish or went without. In more creative times, beaver tails were classified as fish, a theological workaround that few questioned because it meant having something to eat. Milk was common but also fragile. You had to use it quickly or turn it into cheese or butter. Butter was a luxury in some homes, used sparingly. Cheese was harder, tangier, and often quite dry. If you had a few good rounds stored away, it meant the cow had been generous that year. Dairy, though useful, didn't always agree with people, and refrigeration didn't exist. Sour milk was used anyway. Butter went rancid. Cheese molded. You just cut around the worst bits and hoped your stomach was stronger than the bacteria. Drinks were simple. Water was unreliable, often unsafe to drink, depending on the season and what upstream neighbor had been careless. So ale was the default. Weak ale, known as small beer, was brewed in homes and drunk by everyone, including children. It had low alcohol, just enough to kill bacteria and dull the edges of thirst. If you had access to apples or pears, you might make cider. Wine was for the clergy and nobility. Mead was rare. Milk was for the young and the sick. Otherwise, it was ale with breakfast, ale with lunch, and ale to help forget that tomorrow would taste exactly like today. Vegetables formed the bulk of your diet. Cabbage, onions, garlic, turnips, leeks, carrots, though not the orange ones we know now. Medieval carrots were white or purple. Most were grown in small gardens, tended carefully, and eaten root to leaf. Nothing was wasted. The tops of turnips might be boiled into greens. The skins were composted or tossed into the fire. Fruit was seasonal, apples mostly, maybe some berries or wild plums. If you dried them, they lasted through winter. Otherwise, they were eaten fast. Preserving was difficult. Sugar was nearly impossible to afford. Honey, if you had bees, was a treasured sweetener. Otherwise, your pottage stayed savory, in the loosest sense of the word. Herbs were grown when possible: parsley, sage, dill, mint. They weren't used for flavor so much as medicine or tradition. Some herbs were thought to protect against illness. Others kept pests away. Occasionally, they even made things taste a little better. But that was a happy accident, not the goal. Meals were eaten together, on benches, around the fire. There were no courses, no recipes, just a pot, a hunk of bread, and the hope that there would still be something left tomorrow. You didn't complain. Complaining didn't make the stew thicker. If you had a feast, a wedding, a harvest festival, a saint's day, you might roast a bird or bake a pie. Not the flaky, buttery kind. A medieval pie was more like a sealed box made of hard dough to hold a meat filling, often heavily spiced if spices were available, which they usually weren't. You might flavor it with pepper, ginger, or cinnamon if someone had traded well. Most days weren't feast days. Most days were quiet. You scraped your bowl, you soaked your bread, you drank your ale, and you leaned back, full enough to get through the evening, if not exactly satisfied. There was comfort in repetition, in knowing what the pot would taste like, in knowing how much bread was left, in watching the same hands prepare the same meal by the same fire as the wind whispered through the cracks in the wall and the animals shifted in their sleep. The stew boiled, the bread cooled, and you, once again, had enough. If you were a medieval peasant, you didn't own much. You might have a patch of land, a few tools, a couple of animals, a crooked house you built with your own hands, but none of it, technically, was yours. It all belonged to the Lord, not a king, not someone mythical or distant, just your local landholder, the one who lived up the hill in a slightly less crooked house, with slightly better food, and a roof that probably didn't leak. He owned the land, which meant he owned everything on it, including, in a sense, you. You were what was called a villain. That's not an insult, it's a category. You worked the land, but you didn't own it. You were bound to it. You couldn't leave without permission. You couldn't pass it on freely. You owed labor, goods, and deference. You weren't a slave, but you weren't exactly free either. Your relationship with the Lord wasn't built on conversation. It was built on obligation. You didn't talk to him. You talked to the steward, the man who managed his lands and, more importantly, kept track of what everyone owed. And you owed a lot. Let's start with labor. A few days a week, sometimes more during harvest, you were expected to work the Lord's fields instead of your own. This was called corvée labor. You got nothing for it, no payment, no thanks, just a knowledge that somewhere in the manor house, someone ate because of what you did. You also owed taxes, and they came in many shapes. A portion of your grain, a share of your wool, a chicken here, some eggs there. If you brewed ale, you owed ale. If you had a pig, you owed bacon. If you managed to catch fish, guess who owned the river? The taxes didn't end with food. If you used the mill, you paid a fee. Even though the mill was the only way to grind your grain, even though the Lord owned the mill and set the price. You might be tempted to grind it by hand, but doing so was often illegal, punishable by fine or worse, because the Lord didn't just want his share. He wanted control. Same with the oven. Many manors had a communal oven, one you paid to use. If you tried baking at home and the steward found out, there could be consequences. You learned to do things the official way, even if it took longer, cost more, and made less sense. And then there were the fees. Want to get married? Pay a fee. Want to inherit your father's plot? There's a fee. Want to move to another village? First, ask permission, then, you guessed it, pay a fee. Your livestock? Taxed. Your tools? Sometimes taxed. Your ability to breathe without permission? Barely untaxed. And what did you get in return? Well, the Lord was supposed to protect you, in theory. If bandits attacked, or if a rival noble invaded, the Lord had men-at-arms who could fight. If famine struck, he might distribute grain from his stores, though rarely for free. And if you had a legal dispute, say, your neighbor's goat wandered into your garden and refused to leave, the Lord's court might settle it. Again, not for free. This was feudalism, a system of obligations and hierarchy wrapped in the language of loyalty and protection. In practice, It was a system of ownership. The land was everything. Those who owned it ruled. Those who worked it obeyed. The manor itself stood apart from the village, sometimes literally on higher ground. It might be made of stone or timber, larger than any peasant's home, with a roof thatched so thick no wind dared enter. Inside were tapestries, tables, servants, and the lord, of course, wearing wool lined with fur, eating meals you couldn't imagine, and thinking very little about you. He might not know your name, but he knew your numbers. How much barley you owed this year, how many eggs you'd promised, whether your son had reached the age where he could be added to the labor rolls. Everything was recorded, not by you. You couldn't read, but by the steward, the reeve, the bailiff, men with wax tablets or bits of parchment who came around with questions you learned to answer carefully. And if you didn't meet your obligations, there were punishments. Fines, usually, more goods taken, days added to your labor. In extreme cases, your tools could be confiscated, or your land reclaimed, or your house, your goats, your dignity, all of it gone. You didn't resist. Resistance wasn't rebellion, it was foolishness. But here's the strange part. The system worked, not because it was fair, but because it was stable. It had rules, predictable, if harsh. You knew what you owed. You knew what was expected. There was no guessing, no sudden surprises, just a steady, grinding rhythm of give, 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 and occasionally, just occasionally, the Lord would give something back. A feast day where food was distributed, a holiday where labor was waived, a kind word, perhaps, spoken from horseback. Not enough to balance the scales, but enough to keep things from tipping. The relationship was never friendly, but it was enduring. Your Lord might be young or old, kind or cruel, present or distant, but he was always above you. You didn't question that. You bowed when he passed. You removed your cap. You used the right words, not because he deserved it, but because you didn't want trouble. And maybe, deep down, because a small part of you still hoped that one day you might be noticed, rewarded, lifted, even just a little. It almost never happened, but that's how the system stayed alive. Not just with fear, but with the faintest suggestion of hope. Meanwhile, the steward kept walking, the reeve kept writing, the mill kept grinding, and you kept digging your hands into the soil, year after year, season after season. There was no retirement, no bonus, no upward mobility, only the quiet knowledge that you had fulfilled your role. You had done what was asked. You had made it through another year under the weight of someone else's title. And as long as the Lord was pleased, you were allowed to go on living. Long before the Black Death swept across Europe and etched itself into history books, medieval peasants were already well acquainted with sickness, not the kind of illness that came and went with the seasons, though there was plenty of that too, but the slow, constant presence of something always waiting to go wrong. Infection, fever, wasting, swelling, coughing. Disease wasn't an event, it was a feature of life. You didn't need a continent-wide catastrophe to be laid low. All it took was a small cut, a single flea, a bit of water that looked clear but wasn't. And unlike weather or taxes, illness didn't follow rules. It arrived without warning, and it rarely left quietly. There were no hospitals, not really. If you were lucky, your village had a wise woman, maybe a midwife, someone who knew which herbs to boil and which ones to burn. If you were extremely lucky, there might be a monk nearby, literate, well-meaning, and slightly more effective than random prayer. But for the most part, when you got sick, you stayed home, you lay in bed, you sweated through your shirt, and you hoped. Most people didn't understand what caused disease. The word germ hadn't been invented yet. Microscopes were centuries away. What you had were theories, old ones, confusing ones, and often wrong ones. Some believed in miasma, bad air that carried disease through smell. If a village reeked of rot, manure, and smoke, it was assumed to be dangerous, which, in a way, was correct, but not for the reasons people thought. To combat the bad air, people stuffed herbs into their clothes, carried flowers in their sleeves, or walked around with vinegar-soaked rags pressed to their faces. Not pleasant, not helpful, but deeply believed. Others blamed divine punishment. Illness came from sin, from impure thoughts, disobedient acts, or general moral decay. If your child fell ill, it was a test. If your crops failed, and then your body failed, It was probably your fault, or your neighbor's, or both. There were local traditions, too. Some thought illness came from an evil eye, a glare from someone jealous or angry. Others blamed moon phases, animal spirits, or grumpy saints. One particularly popular explanation was that sickness entered the body through the soles of the feet. The solution? Boil them. And if that didn't work, burn something nearby, possibly your mattress. The cures were as strange as the causes. If you had a fever, you might be bled. A local man would arrive with a blade, a bowl, and more confidence than training. Sometimes leeches were used, sometimes sharp stones. The idea was to balance your humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If they were out of sync, so were you. No one ever saw these humors, of course, but they were blamed for nearly everything. For swelling, there were poultices, smears of mashed herbs, mud, or even bread wrapped in cloth and tied to the body. Some worked, most didn't. A few made things worse, but the important thing was that something was being done. If your stomach ached, you might chew on charcoal. If you coughed blood, you might drink wine mixed with crushed pearls. If your eyes blurred, someone might whisper a prayer while blowing smoke over your head. If your leg turned black, you were probably out of options. And then there were the plague amulets, bits of metal or bone worn around the neck, sometimes inscribed with protective words, sometimes blessed by a priest. Some people buried onions in the corners of their homes. Others hung garlic above the door. One popular remedy was to tie a live chicken to the infected area and hope the illness transferred to the bird. It rarely did, but hope was in short supply, and people clung to whatever they could. Sickness was isolating, but not in the way we think of now. You didn't quarantine. You didn't call for help. You just tried to work until you couldn't. When that moment came, you laid down, and others carried on. Children were fed. Animals were fed. You were given broth, maybe, and a few murmured prayers. Sometimes illness passed. The fever broke. The swelling went down. You walked again slowly, with a new limp and a deeper respect for warm soup. Other times, it didn't, and your family lit a candle. Plague, in the broader sense, wasn't always the dramatic kind that left bodies in carts. More often, it was a slow infection, skin turning dark, limbs swelling, a cough deep enough to rattle the walls. Smallpox, leprosy, dysentery, even the flu could sweep through a village and leave half the population in bed. There were no case numbers, no charts, just stories. A traveler from another village said the cough had started there last week, or someone heard that 3 children had died near the river. You paid attention. You started boiling more water. You left herbs under the door. You kept your distance, even if no one said why. Death was not always feared, but it was recognized. People knew when it was near. They knew the signs: breathing that slowed, skin that cooled, eyes that turned dull. There were prayers for the dying, soft ones, whispered by firelight. When the Black Death finally did arrive in the 14th century, it hit with a violence that dwarfed everything before it. But by then, the world was already familiar with sickness. The idea that you could be well in the morning and gone by night was not new. It was just happening more often. The plague came in waves, and each time, it returned stronger, stranger. Buboes swelling in the neck and groin, fever that stole the mind, blood that darkened and bubbled. People died in days, sometimes in hours. Entire villages vanished. Fields went untilled. Bells rang too often. Some peasants tried to flee, but disease travels faster than feet. Others turned to religion, doubling their prayers, whipping their backs, promising to live better if they were spared. A few turned to violence, blaming outsiders, blaming sinners, blaming anyone but the wind. The church offered explanations and comfort and burial. Monks died in droves, priests vanished. In some places, death became so common that the funerals were skipped. Bodies were buried in mass graves, often without names. And yet, life continued. People learned how to survive around sickness. They accepted it the way they accepted hunger or cold, not joyfully, but with a kind of tired resilience. They cleaned their homes more often. They shared herbs. They whispered new prayers. Some believed that surviving one sickness gave them protection against the next. Others didn't believe at all, but they got up anyway and milked the cow. Children grew up learning which plants to avoid, which ones to chew, and which ones to boil until they stopped smelling like feet. They knew how to wrap a wound, how to wait out a fever, how to tell when someone wasn't going to get better, and when you should stop hoping. And through it all, they didn't stop living. They married, they harvested, they shared meals, such as they were. They sat by the fire and retold stories of the last illness, and the time someone's grandfather survived a winter fever with nothing but garlic water and stubbornness. Plague wasn't the end of the world. It was just another part of it. And for those who endured, survival became its own kind of resistance. A quiet, stubborn refusal to go quietly. A belief that tomorrow would come, and if it didn't, someone else would remember your name, or at least the way you always added rosemary to the broth. Night in the medieval countryside wasn't peaceful. It was silent in the way a cave is silent, full of creaks, distant sounds, and the kind of quiet that makes you notice how loudly your own body exists. The day ended when the light failed, and everything that wasn't already put away had to be dealt with quickly because, once darkness fell, the world shrank to the size of your hearth. There was no artificial light, no candles burning freely into the night. Wax was too valuable. If you had a tallow lamp, it was reserved for emergencies or religious devotions. Most nights, the fire dimmed, the coals glowed softly, and that was all. And so you slept, but not in the way we think of sleep, not in a single, unbroken stretch. Sleep in the Middle Ages came in 2 acts. First sleep, then a waking period, and finally a second sleep. This rhythm wasn't accidental. It was how people adapted to the long, lightless hours between dusk and dawn. You would drift into your first sleep, not long after nightfall. The fire would be banked, the animals would have quieted, children would be hushed, the home, one room, maybe 2, would stretch out into stillness. If you had a mattress, it was stuffed with straw or feathers, possibly lumpy, often shared. If you didn't, you slept on woven rushes or directly on the earth, softened only by habit. Everyone slept together, family, relatives, even servants, all in one shared space, not out of closeness, but out of necessity. It was the only warm room in the house. On the coldest nights, even animals were brought inside. A goat near the door, a dog curled by the hearth, chickens in a basket. Warmth was more important than boundaries. There was no privacy. The idea of sleeping alone was associated with punishment, not comfort. The rich might afford solitude. Everyone else just made do. You turned to face the wall. You stuffed straw in your ears. You shared blankets. You breathed in each other's breath. And if someone snored, and someone always did, you got used to it. First sleep lasted a few hours. Then, almost like clockwork, people would wake. It wasn't disturbing, it was expected. During this time, the world was still and quiet. Some people prayed, others stirred the coals, some used the chamber pot, or stepped outside into the freezing air. Some reflected, others whispered. It was a time of dreams, too vivid ones. People believed this midnight space opened a thin veil between the living and the dead, between the sacred and the mundane. If you dreamed during this waking interval, you remembered it, and you talked about it the next morning, not in passing, but as something that mattered. Eventually, the second sleep began, deeper, slower. This was the sleep that healed, or tried to. It was when the aches faded slightly, when the day's blisters cooled. If you were lucky, it was uninterrupted. If you weren't, you simply lay still and waited for dawn to give you an excuse to rise. The home didn't go silent at night, not entirely. The fire crackled, wind whispered through the thatch. A baby might fuss, a cow might shuffle its hooves. Sometimes, the night was broken by coughing, the wet, rattling kind that never seemed to end. And everyone noticed, but no one said anything. It was understood. The fear of the dark was real, and not irrational. The night carried real dangers, both imagined and entirely physical. Wolves, for instance, in some regions, their howls came close enough to the village to raise hairs on the back of your neck. They weren't just creatures of legend, they were real and hungry. Then there were thieves, rogues, strangers, fires that started from a careless coal, roofs that groaned under snow, and less explainable things, ghosts, spirits, demons, witches. You didn't talk about them openly, but you knew they were out there. To protect the household, you followed rituals. You placed iron by the door, made the sign of the cross above the hearth, whispered protective blessings over the straw mattress, hung herbs, rosemary, sage, rue above entryways. Sometimes, you tied a bit of string around a child's wrist, just in case. Even with protection, some families believed that sleep left you vulnerable, that the soul wandered while the body rested. So people tucked in carefully, covered mirrors, faced the bed toward the fire, avoided sleeping with their feet pointed toward the door. The cold was its own enemy. It seeped through walls, through thatch, through poorly sealed doors. People didn't sleep under mounds of blankets. They layered wool, fur, cloaks, tunics. The idea of undressing for bed would have seemed absurd. You slept in your clothes, sometimes in your boots. There was a comfort to sleeping next to others, but also discomfort. Someone always shifted, someone always murmured. There were elbows, knees, the occasional surprise from the family dog. But this was normal. You didn't expect silence. You expected closeness. And in that closeness, you found a strange kind of security. You heard your father breathe, your child twitch, your grandmother mutter a prayer in her sleep. It wasn't peaceful, but it was human. It was shared. When you dreamed, your dreams mattered. A field of wheat might mean prosperity. A snake illness. A broken tooth could mean death. You learned to interpret these things. Or you found someone who could. The village had dream readers, not officially, but everyone knew who to ask. The church had its own ideas. It warned that some dreams were from the devil, that sleep was a time when temptation could slip in. You were told to pray before bed, to avoid certain thoughts, to keep your soul ready in case the night was your last, because it could be. People went to sleep and didn't wake up. Illness could take hold while you rested. A fever could rise. A cough could deepen. And by morning, someone might be gone, quietly, as if stolen. This uncertainty gave every morning a slightly reverent tone. When the light returned and the rooster cried out and the coals were stirred back to life, it meant you'd survived again. You sat up slowly. Every joint reminded you of your age, no matter how young you were. The cold bit your nose. You wiped your face. You looked around and counted bodies. Everyone who stirred was accounted for. Everyone who didn't was checked on. And then, once the living were confirmed, the day began. Water was fetched. Bread was prepared. Animals were fed. The dream you had, if it was important, was shared. And the memory of the night faded, not erased, just softened, folded into the next stretch of time. In winter, sleep came early and stayed late. In summer, it shortened, but the rhythm remained. First sleep, a waking hour. Second sleep, a world without clocks, but not without routine. And for all its discomfort, there was something grounding in that rhythm, something honest. You didn't aim for comfort. You aimed for endurance. And if you happened to find rest along the way, a moment of warmth, a particularly quiet night, a dream that didn't leave you afraid, that was a gift, one you didn't question, one you didn't expect to gain too soon. Some years, you're simply hungry. Other years, you're in a famine. It's not the same. Hunger is manageable. It has rules. You stretch food. You ration. You hope. But famine breaks the rules. It's when the fields fail, the root cellar is bare, and there's no more pretending that next week will be better. It's when food becomes an idea more than a substance. In a medieval village, you often saw it coming. It started in the spring. Too much rain or none. The barley came up patchy. The beans flowered then browned. The cabbages cracked open too early. The wheat heads stayed stunted, bowed like they were already mourning something. You noticed. Everyone did. At first, no one said it. But the looks were exchanged, the calculations made quietly, internally. How much is left from last year? How much seed can we keep? How much can we afford to eat? The answers were never good. The hardest part was knowing what to do next. Not in winter, but in summer, because that's when you had to choose between planting the seeds or grinding them into flour, between saving for a harvest that might never come or feeding your child one more bowl of something warm. And so the portions began to shrink. The stew got thinner, the bread got smaller, the bowls didn't come back empty. They just came back less often. You didn't panic, not yet. You told yourself this happened once before, or that another village might have extra, or that the manor stores could fill in the gaps. Hope was still on the table, just not much else. By August, it became harder to ignore. By September, it became impossible. You stopped feeding the animals first. Chickens were quiet. The goat's bleating grew hollow. The dog, if you had one, stopped barking and started following you more closely, like it understood it was next. Bread became ritual. One loaf split 5 ways. Everyone chewed slower. No one commented on the crust. Even the smallest crumb was swept up with reverence. The stew was now mostly water. If it had color, it was from the pot. You boiled weeds. You ground roots. You pulled up things you didn't recognize and hoped they weren't poisonous. Some weren't. You didn't sleep through the night. Not because you were afraid, but because your stomach reminded you every few hours that it was still empty. The children asked fewer questions. That's how you knew it was real. They didn't ask when the bread was coming. They didn't ask for honey. They didn't beg for stories. They sat close to the fire and stared. They learned how to wait. And your neighbors, you stopped seeing them outside. The village quieted. No more laughter in the lane. No more arguments about sheep. Just the occasional cough or crack of firewood. Famine didn't make people cruel. It made them silent. Sometimes, someone would bring back a rabbit or a bird or a handful of acorns that could be soaked and ground. You chewed them, even when they still tasted bitter. You smiled anyway, not because it tasted good, but because it was something. You tried not to resent the manor. Sometimes they gave grain. Sometimes they didn't. The steward came around less. That was good and bad. Good because he wasn't there to take anything. Bad because he wasn't there to help either. His silence said more than words ever could. The church did what it could. Bread after Mass. Alms for the poorest. But they, too, were stretched. You prayed more. Not out of faith, but out of repetition. Words are easy when your hands are too tired to do anything else. Some left the village entirely. Packed up and wandered to find work or food or God. Some returned. Some didn't. You never asked what happened. You were too tired. The body changes in famine. You feel your ribs first, not from the outside, but from within, like they're too close to your skin. You stand up slower. You bruise easier. You wake up with your hands clenched, like they're still gripping tools you can't afford to use anymore. And the cold hurts more. The fire is your best friend. You spend more time tending it than you ever did cooking on it. You sit close. You sleep facing it. You feed it, even as your belly goes empty, because heat is the one luxury you can still provide. By now, you've eaten everything that could be eaten. The roots, the weeds, the dried beans, the stale flour. You've boiled bones 3 times over. You've soaked bark. You've baked famine bread that cracked your tooth. And when the food was gone, you looked to the things that weren't food but might become food in the right light. Leather, boiled and salted, not delicious, not satisfying, but technically chewable. You found a rat once. You didn't scream. You thanked God. Then you hid it, cooked it alone, told no one. You still feel guilty, but you don't regret it. The dreams become strange. You dream of feasts, tables full of roast and bread and wine. You wake up chewing your tongue. You dream of boiling things over and over, even though you haven't boiled anything in 3 days. You dream of animals coming back, of green shoots breaking through snow. You dream of your childhood, when hunger was simpler. And some nights, you dream of being full. You wake from those crying. The graveyard grew slowly at first, then quickly, then too quickly to keep up. You knew someone had died when the church bell didn't ring. It meant there weren't enough hands to lift the rope. The grave was shallow, the prayer was short, the mourning was silent. Everyone had their own hunger to manage. You wanted to mourn, but you couldn't afford the emotion. You held it back, like everything else. Then, like every famine, it ended, not suddenly, but steadily. Rain came, and it stayed. The ground softened, seeds germinated, plants reached up, weak but real. You had enough energy to hope again. You saved the first harvest for others, children first, elders next. You took the smallest bowl. You smiled as you passed it. And when the first good loaf came out of the oven, cracked on top, dark on the bottom, you stared at it before you ate. You remembered every day you went without, every trick you used, every lie you told to spare someone else. You ate slowly, and this time, it filled you. By the time you could walk, The church had already marked you. It had taken your name at baptism, blessed your breath with Latin you'd never understand, and stitched your soul into a system that extended far beyond your village. You belonged to the church, not because you chose to, but because there wasn't another option. In the quiet corners of your life, those dim early mornings before the fire had caught, those wet nights when the wind howled through the shutters, you felt its presence like gravity. It didn't just exist beside your life. It organized it, judged it, taxed it, forgave it, and defined what came after it. The church wasn't a place you visited. It was the air around you, the road beneath your feet, the rhythm of your year. It was the voice that murmured over your grave and the one that whispered about it decades before you got there. The village priest, often the only person who could read, was not just your confessor. He was also your calendar, your counselor, and the nearest thing to an oracle you had. He held the mysteries of the sky and the stories of the saints and knew why a pig might die or a storm might come. He walked through the village like a man carrying both blessing and thread in his robes. You brought your sins to him in whispers, hoping he wouldn't look disappointed. You tried not to think about what he knew. You saw him at birth, marriage, and death, free of the only guaranteed ceremonies of a peasant's life. And in between, he spoke for a God you feared more than you loved, because love, you were told, required obedience. Latin was the language of the Mass, and it might as well have been a spell. You stood in the church beside your family, feet numb from cold, listening to words that never belonged to you. You didn't know what the priest said as he lifted the bread, but you believed, or tried to, that something invisible had happened, that the bread wasn't bread, that the wine wasn't wine, that the murmuring of words and gestures could move the divine. You didn't speak the words, but they moved through you anyway. You mouthed along where you could. You crossed yourself when the others did. You learned the rhythm of holiness like someone learns the path to a well, without understanding every step, only that you needed it. The church told you when to fast and when to feast. It carved the year into sacred pieces: Lent, Advent, Epiphany, All Saints. You didn't say March or April. You said after Easter or near St. Michael's. It told you what you could eat, when you could eat it, and how guilty you should feel about enjoying it. 40 days without meat before Easter, followed by a feast so rich it made you dizzy. Friday fish, even if you lived nowhere near water. Almond milk for the wealthy. Turnips and cold broth for everyone else. On saint days, you shared what you could. On fast days, you imagined what you couldn't. But even when your bowl was empty, your plate was full of rules. Your calendar wasn't just for prayer. It was also for payment. The church collected 1/10 of your yield, no matter the season: grain, eggs, wool, chickens, cider. If it came from your field or your body, it had a price. You gave because it was God's portion. That's what you were told. But God didn't collect it. The priest did, or the steward with his ledgers and his silent nods. You watched your best barley carted off to the tithe barn, which was always bigger than your home. You saw your neighbor's hand over their last sack of oats, while the priest prayed for mercy they had just paid for. And when the harvest failed, when the rains came too late or the frost too early, the demand didn't change. You owed what you owed. Sometimes they let you pay in candles or labor. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes the debt grew so heavy it bent your back, even when you stood upright. But the church didn't just take. It gave, too, though not always in the way you wanted. It gave stories. It gave structure. It gave reasons. When your cow died without cause, the priest told you which saint to pray to. When your child fell ill, he told you it might be a test or a punishment or the devil slipping in through a crack in your belief. He offered blessings and sacraments, told you to light a candle or visit a shrine. Sometimes he gave you a scrap of relic, an old bone, a tooth, a ribbon soaked in some forgotten martyr's blood. You held it like treasure. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but even when it didn't, it was better than nothing. There were saints for everything: Saint Apollonia for teeth, Saint Isidore for plowing, Saint Sebastian for plague. You didn't know where they were buried or when they lived. You only knew their names and what they could fix. Their stories were half memory, half magic, told in flickering firelight by people who weren't sure where truth ended and legend began. You called on them when you had nothing else. You whispered their names as you stirred the pot or knelt in the field. You made deals with them, promised bread or fasting or a pilgrimage if only they'd help you this once. Sometimes they did, or seemed to, and that was enough to ask again. Pilgrimage was a holy journey, but also a way to leave for a few days. You stepped outside the same 5 miles you'd lived your entire life. You walked roads you didn't know, towards shrines you'd only heard of. You carried your prayers with you, strapped to your back, clutched in your hands. You slept under hedges or in the corners of barns. You arrived, footsore and raw, stood before a bone or a statue, and hoped something would shift inside you. Sometimes it did. You returned, not healed, but changed, or at least tired enough to believe you had been. Even death was a ritual, choreographed by the church. When you felt it near, you sent for the priest. He came with oil and words. He touched your forehead, prayed over your body, tried to ease your soul into what came next. Your family gathered, the candles were lit. The bell might ring if someone had the strength. You were buried on sacred ground, beside others who had walked the same path. And then came the masses. Your family lit more candles, paid for prayers, hoped the priest remembered your name in his chants. Because even in death, there were debts. The church taught that your soul might not go straight to heaven. It might linger in purgatory, a shadowed hallway between suffering and salvation. You could wait there for years or centuries or longer, unless someone helped, unless someone prayed, paid, lit enough candles, said your name often enough to pull you through. And so your family paid what they could. The poor gave bread, the rich gave land, all to shorten a stay in a place no one had seen, but everyone feared, because fear, too, was part of the church's gift. The church explained the world when no one else could. It told you why the rains failed, why your child didn't wake, why illness took the young and spared the cruel. It told you that suffering had purpose, that obedience had reward. It gave you structure in the middle of chaos, and that structure, even when it burdened you, gave you peace. Not comfort, always, but peace. You never questioned the church's power, not seriously, not out loud. You might grumble about the tithe or curse when the priest looked the other way, but you never stopped showing up. You didn't stop kneeling. You didn't stop crossing yourself when the bell rang. Because if the church wasn't right, then the world had no shape at all, and a world with no shape was a terrifying thing. Even when the priest drank too much, even when the bishop demanded too many taxes, even when the indulgent seller passed through town with a cart full of promises and a purse full of coins, you still believed, or you acted like you did, which, in the end, was mostly the same, because belief was less about what you thought than what you did. You didn't understand Aladdin, but you understood the structure. You stayed inside it because it was the only way forward. And when you died, you hoped the bells would ring, and the candles would burn, and your name would be said often enough to matter. You hoped the saints still listened. You hoped your sins had been counted and forgiven in equal measure. You hoped the church, in all its weight and mystery and dust and gold, would carry you the rest of the way. You might think that after everything they endured, after the famines and plagues, after the tithes and taxes, and the heavy boot of the manor's authority, peasants would have risen up more often, that the weight of centuries of suffering would have built up until it cracked the walls of their villages, until one cold morning the frost would thaw, and something inside them would snap. You might think they would have gathered in fields and marketplaces, tools in hand and fire in their hearts, shouting that they would kneel no longer. But they didn't, not often, not for long, and never all at once. There were revolts, yes. The peasants' revolt in England in 1381, the Jacquerie in France a few decades earlier, small uprisings scattered across Europe like stones thrown into a still pond, angry voices in places where the lords had taken too much, pushed too hard, taxed one coin too many. Sometimes the spark caught. A tax collector's house burned, a steward run out of town, a banner lifted. But those fires burned fast and were snuffed out even faster. They ended in executions, in gallows built in village squares, in silence heavier than the one that came before. The world didn't change. The grain still had to be sown. To understand why peasants didn't revolt more, you have to stop thinking of them as naive or cowardly. They weren't. They were survivors, not of single tragedies, but of unbroken hardship, sustained year after year. They lived in a world of low ceilings, where hope was something rationed like grain. They didn't lack courage, they lacked margin. In a life where every day was spent just trying to keep the roof patched and the soup warm, there was no space left for rebellion. You could plan a revolt, or you could dig potatoes. You couldn't do both. The truth was, the system worked, not because it was just or kind or efficient, but because it was ancient. It had sunk its roots into the habits of generations. It didn't need to be explained. It simply was. You owed labor. You owed grain. You owed the church its tenth, and the Lord his harvest. You owed a quiet nod when the reeve passed your door. You were born into that owing, and unless you were exceptionally lucky, you died in it too. But by staying within those bounds, you could survive. Barely, yes, but you could. The cost of stepping outside those rules was too high. The manor had soldiers, the church had excommunication, the king had no idea you existed, but he had laws that still bound you like rope. The penalty for defiance wasn't always death. Sometimes it was worse, banishment, starvation. Your family left to carry the debt you tried to escape. Everyone had heard a story. A father taken, a mother whipped, a cousin who disappeared after refusing to pay. The stories were passed down, not to stir rebellion, but to prevent it. Besides, rebellion often didn't feel like an option because the people you lived beside were not strangers. They were your kin, your neighbors. You shared fields, tools, fences, and prayers. Even if you hated the steward, you might still marry his daughter. Even if you resented the tithe, you still brought bread to Mass. The village wasn't a place you could leave easily, nor was it one you could tear apart without tearing yourself apart in the process. To revolt against the manor was, in some small way, to revolt against the rhythms of your own life. It's easy, centuries later, to imagine the peasant as a figure of eternal submission, head bowed, hat in hand. But this picture misses the complexity of their world. Submission wasn't servitude, it was negotiation. Most peasants did not simply suffer. They adapted, they bartered, they bent. They found cracks in the walls and made homes in the spaces between the rules. A pig kept off the ledger, an extra sack of rye buried in the earth, a bribe given in eggs rather than coin. These were the rebellions they could afford. They were practical people. Their world was not governed by ideology, but by weather. The question was not what is just, but will this feed us through winter? And justice, if it ever came, was a luxury they didn't trust. The church played its part, too, and perhaps more effectively than the sword. It taught that suffering was holy, that endurance was righteous, that the meek would inherit the earth, though it never said when. You were taught that your trials were not punishment, but purification, that your obedience would be rewarded, not in this life, but in the next. And if the promise of heaven wasn't enough, the threat of hell filled in the rest, fire, torment, gnashing of teeth, all waiting for the proud, the rebellious, the ones who said no. And yet, the peasants were not passive. Their resistance was just quieter. They gossiped about the stewards. They sang rude songs about the Lord's habits. They laughed when the priest stumbled on a sermon. They told stories at night of better days and better men. They found dignity in the smallest acts, a shared crust, a well-timed silence, a field tended just a little differently than the rule book said. Their rebellion was in the way they survived despite it all, not because they accepted the system, but because they made it bend just enough to let them breathe. Sometimes, of course, things changed. A lord died, and his son was kinder. A new bishop forgave debts. A terrible storm reminded the powerful that even they were mortal. But those changes came from above. The peasant's job was to wait, to endure, to hand down what little they had, and to teach their children to be quiet when they had to be and brave when they could be. And there were dreams. Of course there were. You might not have called it revolution, but you thought about a different life. You dreamed of a day when your child wouldn't have to carry the same burdens, when no one would knock on your door with a list of dues, when your back wouldn't ache before 30, when you could sleep without worrying about wolves or soldiers or winter. Those dreams kept you going, but they lived beside reality. You didn't expect them to come true. You just needed them to stay alive. What's perhaps most astonishing is not that peasants revolted so rarely, but that they managed to keep their culture, their faith, their families intact, despite the weight of the system pressing down on them. They kept songs alive that no one wrote down. They passed stories from one hearth to the next. They remembered which plants healed and which ones didn't. They taught one another how to pray, how to birth children, how to bury the dead. They created a continuity that outlasted kings and crusades. And they did it not with banners or battles, but with persistence. Persistence was their rebellion. When the manner demanded too much, they survived anyway. When the church taxed their sins, they still lit candles. When the world turned against them, they huddled close and waited for spring. The fields may have belonged to someone else, but the soil still remembered their hands. Revolution didn't live in them the way it would in later centuries, in the speeches of radicals or the slogans of crowds. But there was a different kind of strength in the way they endured. To live a life of hardship without letting it harden you completely was its own kind of defiance. To kneel, not because you were weak, but because you knew you could rise again tomorrow, that too was a form of resistance. And so they endured quietly, without monuments or songs written in their names. They endured in the rhythm of the plow, in the smoke rising from cottages at dusk, in the lullabies sung beside dying fires. They endured in stories whispered to children who would grow up and tell them again. History often forgets them or folds them into a footnote beneath kings and conquests. But the peasants were the thread that held the tapestry together. Without them, there would have been no harvests, no cathedrals, no armies to march under banners. They built the world, even as they were kept from owning it. They may not have overturned their lords, but they outlasted them. And maybe that is revolution enough. Greetings, dear wanderer, and welcome to this quiet nook of the past. Before we embark on a journey through the frostbitten landscapes of medieval Europe, I extend a heartfelt invitation to you, kind listener. Whether you're curled up in a warm blanket, seeking a moment of calm, or simply craving a tale to soothe your mind, I'm delighted you've joined me. I'd love to hear where you're listening from, perhaps a bustling city or a sleepy village, and what hour of the day wraps you in its embrace. Drop a note if you feel so inclined. It's always a joy to connect with fellow explorers of history. If these gentle, immersive stories resonate with you, consider subscribing to ensure you never miss a chapter. For now, let the cares of today fade as we step into a world where winter's chill was not just a discomfort, but a formidable adversary. A season that tested the very soul of survival. Imagine yourself in the heart of medieval Europe, standing in a rural hamlet where the last autumn leaves have vanished, leaving bare branches clawing at a pale, reluctant sky. The air bites with a sharpness that promises snow, and the fields, once golden with harvest, now lie brittle under a thin layer of frost. Winter looms, not as a mere change of season, but as a harbinger of hardship. For the people of this era, the cold was no fleeting inconvenience. It was a relentless force, seeping into homes, hearts, and hopes. Rivers would soon freeze into mirrors of ice, and snow would bury the land in a silent, suffocating shroud. In an age without modern comforts, insulated walls, electric heaters, or abundant food stores, warmth was a luxury few could afford, and survival demanded every ounce of resilience. Yet, winters were not always so merciless. Long before, the seasons turned with a gentler rhythm, and snowfalls were met with quiet acceptance rather than dread. But something shifted in the heavens, a subtle but profound change that plunged the world into colder, darker times. This was the dawn of the Little Ice Age, a period stretching from the 14th century into the 19th. When temperatures plummeted and winters grew fiercer than memory could recall. Scholars still debate the causes, perhaps shifts in solar activity or volcanic eruptions clouding the skies, but the effects were undeniable. Harvests withered, animals starved, and the wind howled with a cruelty that seemed personal. One chilling tale from this era speaks of the Great Frost of 1709, when Europe froze in a grip so tight that the River Thames in London became a solid path. Merchants set up stalls on the ice, and fires burned atop the frozen river, a bizarre spectacle born of desperation. Yet, even this wonder came at a cost. Many succumbed to the cold, their homes no sanctuary against the frost's relentless invasion. In the midst of such bleakness, there were glimmers of inspiration. Consider young Isaac Newton, then a student at Cambridge, sent home during the Great Frost to his family's rural farm. By the dim light of a crackling hearth, he turned isolation into opportunity, pondering the mysteries of the cosmos. Those quiet, frost-bound days sparked ideas that would later shape his theories on calculus and optics, proving that even winter's darkest hours could birth brilliance. It's a testament to the human spirit's ability to find light in shadow, to transform hardship into hope. For most, however, winter was a trial to endure, not a muse to inspire. The wealthy could shield themselves with heavy cloaks, roaring fires, and stocked pantries. But for the peasantry, the vast majority, life was a daily struggle against the elements. Picture a one-room cottage, its walls patched with mud and straw, where a family huddles around a sputtering fire. The air is thick with smoke, and breath clouds in the chill even indoors. Rising from a straw pallet, you feel the cold numbing your fingers, your toes aching as you pull on threadbare garments. Breakfast, if there is any, might be a thin gruel or a crust of stale bread, the harvest's bounty dwindling with each passing day. Outside, the livestock shiver in their pens, their breath steaming as they chew on sparse, frost-crusted hay. Gathering firewood is a grueling task, your hands raw and bleeding from the cold, but the fire must burn, or the night will claim you. This was the reality for countless souls, a ceaseless battle to outlast the season. Yet, even in such hardship, medieval life pulsed with resilience. The rhythms of nature shaped not just survival, but celebration. Winter was woven with traditions that brought light to the gloom. One such tradition was the Feast of St. Stephen, held on December 26th, a day when the rigid hierarchies of feudal society softened. A peasant might be crowned the lord of misrule, granted brief authority to lead a riotous celebration of feasting, dancing, and laughter. For a fleeting moment, the weight of winter lifted, replaced by the warmth of shared joy. Imagine a village hall, its rafters hung with evergreen boughs, where ale flows freely, and voices rise in psalm. The lord of misrule, perhaps a cheeky farmhand, issues playful decrees, ordering knights to dance or nobles to serve the ale. It was a rare chance to revel, to forget the hunger and cold, and to affirm the bonds that held communities together. These bonds were the true heart of medieval survival. In a snowbound village, neighbors became lifelines. A widow might find a bundle of firewood left at her door, or a family share their last loaf with a starving stranger. Inside cramped homes, families gathered around the hearth, spinning tales of heroes and saints, their voices weaving a tapestry of hope. The firelight flickered on weary faces, but in their eyes burned a quiet determination. They had endured winters before, and they would endure this one, together. These small acts of kindness, a shared meal, a mended roof, a story told in the dark, were the threads that stitched communities through the season's trials. As the weeks dragged on, the snow deepened, and the cold grew sharper. The promise of spring seemed a distant dream. But medieval folk were attuned to the subtlest signs of change, a lengthening of daylight, a softening of the earth. When Plough Monday arrived, the first Monday after Epiphany, it marked a turning point. Ploughs, long idle, were hauled from barns and blessed in vibrant processions, a symbol of life's renewal. The first furrows cut into the thawing soil were a prayer made visible, a pledge that the cycle of growth would begin anew. Villagers gathered, their breath no longer freezing, their faces lit with cautious hope. The worst was over. Spring was stirring. This resilience is humbling. In our world of heated homes and stocked supermarkets, it's hard to fathom the sheer grit required to face a medieval winter. Yet our ancestors did so, year after year, finding joy in the smallest moments, a child's laughter, a neighbor's kindness, a crocus breaking through the frost. Their legacy is one of endurance, a reminder that even in the darkest times, the human spirit seeks light. So, when you next feel winter's chill, pause to honor those who came before. Their struggles and triumphs whisper to us across the centuries, urging us to hold fast to hope, to cherish our communities, and to trust in the spring that always follows. As we close this tale, I hope it has warmed your heart, even as it spoke of cold. If these stories of survival and spirit have touched you, please subscribe and share them with others. There are more journeys to take, more histories to uncover. For now, rest well, dream of green fields and gentle breezes, and know that the promise of spring is never far away. Good night. The frost deepened as winter tightened its hold on medieval Europe, transforming the world into a stark, glittering expanse of ice and snow. For those dwelling in castles, the season brought its own challenges. Stone walls, though grand, were no match for the cold that crept through every crack, chilling even the noblest halls. Servants toiled to keep hearths blazing, hauling logs through snowdrifts to feed fires that barely warmed the cavernous rooms. Kitchens worked tirelessly, preserving meats and grains to sustain the household through months when fresh food was a memory. Yet, even these efforts could falter. One tale tells of a noble lady, wrapped in furs, who perished in her own bedchamber, the cold seeping past her defenses as the fire died in the night. Winter spared no one, from peasant to prince. In villages, the struggle was even grimmer. Imagine a family crowded into a single room, the air thick with the stench of smoke and unwashed bodies. The fire, fed with whatever scraps of wood could be scavenged, offered meager warmth. Children clung to their parents, their small frames shivering under thin blankets. Food was rationed carefully, a handful of dried peas, a sliver of salted pork, perhaps a bitter root foraged from the frozen earth. Hunger was a constant companion, gnawing at bellies as the weeks stretched on. Livestock, too, suffered, their ribs stark against matted fur, their breath steaming in barns that offered little shelter from the wind. Yet, amidst this bleakness, medieval communities found ways to endure. The Feast of St. Stephen was a beacon of light, a day when the world turned upside down. A commoner, crowned lord of misrule, led the village in revelry, commanding knights to sing or lords to pour ale. Laughter echoed through snow-dusted streets as mummers performed body plays, their exaggerated gestures drawing roars from the crowd. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted goose and spiced pies, a rare indulgence that filled hearts as much as stomachs. These moments of joy were fleeting but vital, reminding all that life persisted, even in winter's shadow. The church, too, played its part. Monasteries opened their doors to the poor, offering a pallet of straw and a crust of bread to those in need. Monks tended the sick, their prayers mingling with the groans of the afflicted. Charity was a sacred duty, and many nobles followed suit, distributing grain or firewood to their tenants. One story speaks of a lady who sold her jewels to feed her starving village, her compassion a quiet defiance of winter's cruelty. These acts of kindness were not just generosity, they were survival, binding communities against the season's onslaught. As winter dragged on, the cold seemed to seep into the soul. Disease flourished in cramped, smoky homes. Influenza and pneumonia claimed lives with ruthless efficiency, especially among the young and old. A single cough could spell doom for a household, spreading through the stale air. Medieval medicine, rooted in superstition, offered little help. Herbs and bleeding were no match for winter's maladies. Yet, even as death stalked the land, hope endured. Families shared stories of past springs, of fields bursting with grain, and skies alive with birdsong. These tales were a lifeline, a reminder that winter was not eternal. Plough Monday brought the first stirrings of renewal. Villagers gathered to bless their ploughs, their voices raised in song as they paraded through muddy lanes. The earth, softening under the sun's tentative warmth, welcomed the first seeds. Children ran alongside, their laughter a promise of brighter days. The cycle of life turned once more, and with it came a profound gratitude. To have survived winter was no small feat. It was a victory of spirit over circumstance. Reflecting on these lives, we see a resilience that humbles our modern complaints. A delayed train or a chilly morning pales beside the trials of a medieval winter. Yet their legacy lives in us, their courage, their community, their unyielding hope. As you settle into the warmth of your home, spare a thought for those who faced winter with little more than their wits and their will. Their stories remind us that no night is too dark, no cold too bitter, when we hold fast to each other and the promise of spring. As the winter's chill deepened, the medieval world seemed to hold its breath, suspended in a crystalline stillness, where every sound, the creak of a frozen branch, the crunch of boots on snow, carried a weight of survival. In villages scattered across the frostbitten countryside, life contracted into a singular focus, enduring the cold, the hunger, and the darkness. For the peasant, each dawn brought a fresh battle. Rising from a straw-strewn floor, you might brush frost from your cloak, your fingers stiff and aching as you fumble to coax a spark from damp kindling. The fire, if it caught, offered a fleeting warmth, its smoke curling upward to mingle with the sour tang of unwashed wool and the faint musk of livestock huddled nearby. Food was a precious currency, doled out in meager portions, a spoonful of barley porridge, a rind of cheese, or, if fortune smiled, a scrap of dried fish. The harvest's bounty was a fading memory, and the specter of an empty larder loomed ever closer. In the fields beyond, the land lay silent, locked beneath a blanket of snow that smothered any hope of foraging. The animals, too, bore the season's weight. Cows, their ribs stark beneath patchy hides, chewed listlessly on straw, while chickens, fluffed against the cold, ceased laying eggs. A farmer might trudge through knee-deep drifts to check on his flock, his breath clouding in the air, knowing that a single lost beast could tip his family toward ruin. The cold was a thief, stealing warmth, food, and strength with equal indifference. Yet, it was not just the body that suffered. The soul, too, felt winter's grip. The long nights, unbroken by anything but the howl of wind, could weigh heavy on the heart, stirring fears that spring might never come. The Little Ice Age, which cast its shadow from the 14th century onward, amplified these trials. Rivers that once flowed freely now froze solid, halting trade and isolating villages. In 1431, the Seine in Paris became a glassy highway, with merchants skating goods across its surface, their faces pinched against the biting wind. Crops failed under untimely frosts, and grain stores dwindled faster than expected. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 stands as a grim monument to this era's cruelty. Torrential rains and unseasonable cold rotted seedlings in the fields, leaving granaries empty across northern Europe. In Ypres, a chronicler recorded families boiling nettles and tree bark, their faces gaunt with despair. Some, driven to madness by hunger, turned to unspeakable acts, scavenging what little sustenance they could from the dead. The famine claimed countless lives, with estimates suggesting up to a quarter of some urban populations perished. Yet, even in such darkness, the human spirit flickered, stubborn and unyielding. For those in castles, winter was no less daunting, though cloaked in a veneer of privilege. Stone walls, however grand, were porous to the cold, and tapestries did little to stem the draughts that whistled through arrow slits. Nobles wrapped themselves in furs, ermine, fox, and squirrel, yet still shivered as they paced their halls. The logistics of maintaining a great household were staggering. Servants hauled cartloads of firewood, their hands chapped and bleeding, to feed hearths that burned day and night. Kitchens churned out hearty stews and roasted meats, but even these required careful rationing, as fresh provisions were scarce. One tale from 1420 speaks of a northern English lord who, desperate to warm his hall, ordered his men to burn a cherished oak table, its carved surface reduced to ash for a fleeting hour of heat. His retainers whispered of his folly, but none dared voice their complaints aloud, for winter's bite spared no rank. Disease, too, stalked the highborn as fiercely as the low. Castles, with their bustling retinues of servants, knights, and visitors, were breeding grounds for contagion. A single cough could spread influenza through the crowded halls, felling squires and ladies alike. In 1348, the Black Death swept through Europe, its winter outbreaks particularly deadly and cramped. smoky quarters. In Siena, a monk's diary laments the silence of the streets, where the wails of the dying echo from every house, and the living scarce dare to breathe. The plague's toll was staggering, claiming up to half the continent's population in some regions. Winter's chill exacerbated the suffering, as weakened bodies succumbed to cold and hunger alongside disease. Yet, amidst this devastation, acts of compassion shone. Nuns and monks braved the infected to tend the sick, their prayers a quiet defiance against despair. In villages, survival hinged on community. Neighbors became kin in the face of winter's trials. A farmer might share his last sack of barley with a struggling widow, knowing she had no one else. In return, she might mend his torn cloak, her needlework a small but vital contribution. One story from a 15th century chronicle tells of a village in Bavaria where, during a brutal snowstorm, the men took turns trudging through the drifts to deliver firewood to the elderly. One young man, barely 16, carried a bundle to an old woman named Greta, whose hearth had gone cold. Exhausted and frostbitten, he collapsed at her door, but his act ensured her survival. Such stories were not rare. They were the heartbeat of medieval life, a reminder that kindness could warm where fire could not. The church offered another pillar of strength. Monasteries, often the only refuge for the destitute, opened their gates to the shivering and starving. Monks brewed ale and baked bread, distributing it to those who knocked. In 1392, a Cistercian abbey in Yorkshire recorded feeding over 100 souls daily during a harsh winter. Their stores stretched thin, but never refused. Religious festivals, too, provided solace. The Feast of St. Stephen, with its Lord of Misrule, was a burst of color in the gray. Picture a village square, lit by bonfires, where a plowman, crowned with a makeshift wreath, leads a dance under the stars. Laughter mingles with the crackle of flames as children chase each other through the snow, their cheeks flushed with joy. Minstrels strum lutes, singing of knights and dragons, while villagers share a communal pot of stew, its warmth a fleeting shield against the cold. These moments of revelry were not mere escapes. They were acts of defiance, proof that winter could not extinguish the human spirit. Another tradition, the wassailing of orchards, saw villagers gather to bless apple trees, singing and pouring cider onto the roots to ensure a bountiful harvest. In the West Country of England, one such night in 1450 was described as a riot of song and firelight, where even the frail joined in, their voices trembling but resolute. These rituals tied the people to the land, to each other, and to the promise of renewal. As February's light stretched longer, hope began to stir. The first snowdrops pushed through the frost, delicate yet defiant, signaling winter's retreat. Plough Monday arrived, a day of celebration and labor. Villagers polished their plows, adorning them with ribbons, and paraded through muddy lanes, their songs waking the earth. The first furrow was a sacred act, a covenant with the land that life would return. In one Suffolk village, a farmer named Thomas, withered by years of toil, taught his son to guide the plow, their hands together on the worn handle. The boy's laughter, bright as the strengthening sun, echoed across the fields, a sound that carried the weight of survival. This cycle of endurance and renewal defined a medieval world. Winter tested every soul, from the king in his drafty hall to the child in her tattered shawl. Yet, through famine, frost, and fever, the people held fast. They shared their last crust, sang through chattering teeth, and watched for spring with unyielding faith. Their resilience is a mirror to our own potential, a reminder that even in our darkest seasons, we can find light. So, as you sit by your modern hearth, be it a radiator's hum or a candle's glow, think of those who came before. Their winters were brutal, but their spirits were unbreakable. Let their courage warm you, and may you dream of spring's green embrace. As the medieval winter tightened its icy grip, the world seemed to shrink, hemmed in by snowdrifts and a sky heavy with the promise of more. In hamlets across Europe, life became a delicate dance of survival, each step measured against the cold's unyielding advance. Picture yourself in a small village, its thatched roofs sagging under the weight of snow, the air sharp with the scent of pine and frost. Inside a peasant's hovel, the walls are patched with mud, barely holding back the wind that whistles through gaps. The family within huddles close, their breath mingling in clouds as they share a single tattered blanket. The fire, fed by twigs scavenged from a dwindling pile, sputters weakly, its light casting long shadows on faces etched with worry. A mother stirs a pot of thin pottage, barley, a few withered onions, perhaps a pinch of dried herbs, praying it will stretch to feed her children another day. Hunger is a constant shadow, its presence as palpable as the cold that numbs fingers and toes. Outside, the landscape is a study in stillness, the fields blanketed in white, the trees skeletal against a leaden sky. The animals, too, bear winter's burden. Sheep huddle in their pens, their wool matted with ice, while pigs root listlessly in frozen mud, their snorts steaming in the frigid air. A farmer is cloak-patched and threadbare, trudges through the snow to check his livestock, knowing their survival is tied to his own. A lost cow or a frozen lamb could mean the difference between scraping by and starvation. The task of gathering firewood is no less daunting. Hours spent hacking at frozen branches, hands raw and bleeding, the weight of each log a reminder of the fire's fleeting warmth. Yet, these labors were not just for survival. They were acts of defiance, a refusal to let winter claim victory. The Little Ice Age, which cast its chill from the 14th century onward, made such struggles even grimmer. The cold was not merely a season but a force that reshaped lives. In 1362, a monstrous storm swept across the North Sea, its gales tearing through coastal villages in England and the Low Countries. Known as the Groatman Drink, or Great Drowning, it swallowed entire towns, leaving behind a trail of shattered homes and drowned fields. Chroniclers wrote of waves that roared like the wrath of God, claiming tens of thousands of lives. In the aftermath, survivors scavenged what little remained, their faces haunted by loss. Yet, even in such devastation, communities rallied. In one Dutch village, a fisherman named Peter, having lost his boat to the flood, led his neighbors in rebuilding a communal barn, their shared labor a bulwark against despair. In the halls of the mighty, winter posed its own challenges. Castles, for all their grandeur, were sieves for the cold. Stone walls, damp with condensation, radiated a chill that no tapestry could fully banish. Nobles wrapped themselves in layers of wool and fur, their breath visible even in their great halls. The task of keeping a castle warm was Herculean. Servants hauled endless cartloads of logs, their backs bent under the weight, to feed fireplaces that roared day and night. Kitchens churned out hearty fare, venison stews, spiced breads, and mulled wine. But even these required careful planning, as winter cut off fresh supplies. One tale from 1398 tells of a French countess who, trapped in her castle by a blizzard, rationed her stores so strictly that her household dined on little more than oat porridge for weeks. Her steward, a loyal man named Guillaume, braved the storm to barter with a neighboring manor, returning with a sack of dried apples that brought tears of gratitude to her eyes. Disease was winter's cruelest ally, thriving in the close, smoky confines of homes and castles alike. Influenza swept through villages like a scythe, its fevered grip claiming young and old. Pneumonia, born of damp and cold, filled lungs with fluid, turning coughs into death rattles. In 1413, a particularly harsh winter in Florence saw a plague outbreak decimate the city's poor quarters. A chronicler noted, "The streets are silent save for the cries of the bereaved, and the air reeks of death." Medieval remedies, herbal poultices, bloodletting, or prayers to saints offered little relief. Yet, amidst this suffering, acts of courage emerged. A nun named Sister Agnes, in a convent near Bruges, tended the sick despite her own frailty, her hands trembling as she spooned broth to fevered lips. Her diary, preserved in the convent's archives, speaks of a light in their eyes, even as death drew near, a testament to the hope that persisted in the darkest hours. Community was the bedrock of survival. In villages, neighbors became lifelines, their generosity a shield against winter's bite. A baker might share his last loaf with a starving family, knowing they had nothing. A carpenter, his fingers numb from cold, might repair a neighbor's leaking roof, his hammer's rhythm a promise of warmth. One story from a 14th century German chronicle tells of a widow named Elsa, whose only son had perished in a snowstorm. Alone and frail, she faced starvation until her village rallied, each household contributing a small portion, a handful of grain, a turnip, a sliver of bacon, to keep her alive. When spring came, Elsa planted a garden in her son's memory, its blooms a quiet thank you to those who had sustained her. The church, too, was a beacon in the gloom. Monasteries opened their gates to the destitute, offering shelter and sustenance. In 1427, an abbey in the Rhineland recorded feeding over 200 souls during a bitter winter, their monks grinding grain by hand when the mill froze. Religious festivals brought light to the darkness, none more cherished than the feast of St. Stephen on December 26th. This day of misrule turned the world upside down, with a peasant crowned Lord of Misrule to lead the revelry. Imagine a village square, aglow with torches, where a young shepherd, his face smudged with soot for luck, commands a knight to dance a jig. Laughter erupts as the knight complies, his armor clanking comically. Mummers perform body skits, their voices carrying over the snow, while tables groan with roast goose, minced pies, and wassail bowls brimming with spiced cider. For one night, the lines of class blur, and all are united in joy. These festivities were more than merriment. They were a defiance of winter's cruelty, a declaration that life would endure. Another tradition, Candlemas on February 2nd, saw churches aglow with candles, their light a symbol of hope's return. Villagers brought tapers to be blessed, believing they held power against storms and sickness. In one Yorkshire parish, a priest named Father Edmund led a Candlemas procession through a blizzard, his flock clutching their flickering lights as they sang hymns against the wind. The chronicler who recorded the event wrote, "Their voices rose like a fire, warming the frozen night." Such moments stitched communities together, their shared faith a thread stronger than the cold. As winter waned, the first signs of spring stirred hearts. Snowdrops and crocuses, fragile yet fierce, pierced the frost, their colors a promise of renewal. Plough Monday, the first Monday after Epiphany, marked the land's awakening. Ploughs, polished and garlanded, were paraded through villages, their blades gleaming with purpose. In one Norfolk hamlet, a farmer named John, his hands calloused from years of toil, led his ox team to the fields, his daughter skipping alongside. As the plow cut the first furrow, the crowd cheered, their voices a hymn to survival. The earth, softened by the sun, welcomed seeds, each one a prayer for abundance. This cycle of endurance and rebirth defined the medieval spirit. Winter was a crucible, forging resilience in the face of hunger, cold, and loss. Yet through it all, people found light, in shared meals, in songs by the fire, in the promise of spring. Their legacy humbles us, reminding us of our own capacity to endure. As you sit in your warm home, perhaps sipping tea or glancing at the frost on your window, think of those who faced winter with little more than courage and community. Their stories are a fire that still burns, warming us across the centuries. Let their strength inspire you, and may you dream of fields green with hope. As winter's icy breath swept across the medieval world, the land seemed to pause, locked in a silent struggle between life and death. Villages huddled beneath blankets of snow, their thatched roofs glistening with frost, while the air carried a sharp, clean bite that stung the lungs. In these hamlets, survival was a daily act of defiance against a season that offered no mercy. Step into a peasant's home, its walls a patchwork of wattle and daub, barely holding back the wind's relentless howl. Inside, a family clusters around a meager fire, its flames flickering against the gloom. The air is thick with the acrid scent of smoke, mingling with the earthy tang of straw and the faint musk of livestock sheltered in a corner. A mother, her hands roughened by cold, stirs a pot of pottage, a thin gruel of oats and foraged roots, while her children, wrapped in a single ragged blanket, watch with hollow eyes. The meal is small, barely enough to quiet the hunger that gnaws at their bellies, but it is all they have until the next dawn. The fields outside lie barren, their furrows hidden beneath a crust of ice. The sun, low and weak, offers little warmth, its rays swallowed by a sky heavy with gray clouds. Farmers tread carefully through the snow, their boots sinking into drifts as they check on their animals. Sheep, their wool clumped with ice, huddle in makeshift pens, while oxen, ribs stark beneath shaggy hides, chew sparse hay with slow, deliberate bites. Losing a single beast could spell ruin, for livestock were not just labor but food, clothing, and currency. The task of gathering firewood was equally critical. Men and women, their fingers numb and chapped, hacked at frozen branches in nearby woods, each log a precious lifeline. The cold was a relentless foe, seeping into bones and sapping strength. Yet every chore, feeding the fire, mending a leaking roof, or milking a shivering cow, was a small victory, a refusal to surrender to winter's grasp. The Little Ice Age, which cast its shadow from the 14th century into the 19th, intensified these struggles. Temperatures plummeted, and winters grew longer and fiercer, reshaping the rhythms of life. In 1540, the river Danube froze so solid that merchants in Vienna drove carts across its surface, their wares bundled against the wind. But the ice was no blessing. It halted trade, stranded travelers, and left villages cut off from supplies. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, triggered by unseasonable cold and relentless rains, was a stark reminder of nature's power. Crops rotted in sodden fields, and granaries stood empty from England to Flanders. In Bruges, a chronicler wrote of mothers weeping as they boiled grass for their children, their faces pale as death. Some, driven to desperation, turned to eating leather or worse, their humanity fraying under hunger's weight. Estimates suggest up to 15% of Europe's population perished, their bodies buried in frozen ground or left unclaimed in snowbound streets. Yet, even in such darkness, the human spirit found ways to endure. In one Norfolk village, during the famine's worst year, a farmer named Edric shared his last sack of rye with his neighbors, knowing it might cost his own family. His wife, Elfjafu, wove baskets from dried reeds to trade for a handful of dried fish, her fingers bleeding from the work. Their act of generosity sparked others. A widow offered her only hen, a blacksmith his spare tools, until the village clung to life through shared sacrifice. These stories, though small, were the threads that wove communities together, binding them against winter's cruelty. In the castles of the highborn, winter was no less daunting, though wrapped in a veneer of privilege. Stone walls, cold as the grave, radiated a damp chill that defied even the grandest fireplaces. Nobles draped themselves in furs, wolf, bear, and marten, yet still shivered as drafts snaked through tapestried halls. The logistics of maintaining a great household were staggering. Servants, their hands cracked from cold, hauled logs through snowdrifts to feed hearths that burned without pause. Kitchens labored to preserve dwindling stocks, turning withered vegetables into soups thickened with barley or beans. In 1370, a Scottish laird, trapped by a blizzard in his keep, ordered his men to slaughter a prized boar to feed his retinue. Its meat roasted over a fire that briefly warmed their spirits. His steward, a wiry man named Duncan, later recalled, "The scent of roasting flesh was a prayer answered, though we knew leaner days lay ahead." Disease was winter's silent partner, thriving in the cramped, smoky spaces where people sought warmth. Influenza and pneumonia spread like wildfire, their symptoms worsened by malnutrition and cold. In 1422, a brutal winter in Paris saw hospitals overflow with the sick, their coughs echoing through stone cloisters. A physician named Maitre Jean, trained in the humoral theories of the day, prescribed hot broths and bleeding, but his remedies often did more harm than good. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe in 1348 to 1349, was particularly deadly in winter, as weakened bodies huddled together, spreading the plague's miasma. In York, a monk named Brother Thomas wrote, "The snow falls ceaselessly, and with it death. Families vanish overnight, their homes silent as tombs." Yet, amidst this despair, acts of compassion shone. A young apothecary in Siena, named Lucia, braved the plague to deliver herbs to the afflicted, her courage a beacon in the dark. The church was a pillar of strength, its doors open to the desperate. Monasteries, often the only refuge for the poor, offered shelter and sustenance. In 1401, A Benedictine abbey in Saxony recorded serving porridge to over 300 souls during a bitter January, their monks toiling by candlelight to grind frozen grain. Nuns, too, played their part, tending the sick with quiet resolve. Sister Beatrice, in a convent near Rouen, spent her nights sewing blankets from scraps. Her fingers pricked raw, but her heart steadfast. "God's warmth is in the giving," she wrote in a letter to her abbess, a sentiment that echoed through the ages. Festivals brought light to the gloom, none more cherished than the feast of St. Stephen on December 26th. This day of misrule turned the world topsy-turvy, as a peasant was crowned Lord of Misrule, granted brief dominion over knights and lords. Picture a village green, lit by bonfires, where a plowman named What, his cap adorned with holly, orders a stern bailiff to sing a bawdy tune. The crowd roars with laughter as the bailiff complies, his voice cracking with embarrassment. Mummers weave through the throng, their faces painted, performing skits of saints and dragons, while children chase each other through the snow, their shrieks mingling with the crackle of flames. Tables groan with roasted capons, spiced pies, and bowls of wassail, its warm cider laced with cinnamon and cloves. For one night, hunger and cold recede, replaced by the warmth of community. Other traditions, too, sustained the spirit. On Candlemas, February 2nd, churches glowed with blessed candles, their light a symbol of hope's return. In a Welsh village, a priest named Father Owain led his flock through a snowstorm, their tapers flickering against the wind. "The light holds," he said, his voice steady, "as does our faith." Wassailing, another cherished rite, saw villagers gather in orchards to sing to apple trees, pouring cider onto their roots to ensure a fruitful harvest. In 1445, a Somerset chronicler described such a night. The fires blazed, and voices rose in song, as if to wake the trees from winter's sleep. These rituals were not mere superstition, they were acts of faith, tying the people to the land and to each other. Winter's toll was not only physical but emotional. The long nights, unbroken by anything but the wind's mournful howl, could weigh heavy on the soul. In 1387, a chronicler in Cologne wrote of a melancholy that seeps into the heart, as if the sun has forgotten us. Yet, medieval folk found solace in storytelling. By the hearth, families spun tales of heroes like Roland or saints like Nicholas, their voices weaving a shield against despair. In one Lincolnshire village, an old woman named Edith, her eyes clouded with age, recounted the legend of the Wild Hunt, a spectral host riding the winter winds to wide-eyed children. "Fear not the storm," she said, "for it carries the brave to glory." Her stories, passed down through generations, were a reminder that even the darkest nights held magic. As February dawned, the first signs of spring stirred hope. Snowdrops bloomed, their delicate petals piercing the frost, while the days stretched longer, their lights softer but stronger. Plough Monday, the first Monday after Epiphany, marked the land's rebirth. Ploughs, polished and decked with ribbons, were paraded through muddy lanes, their blades gleaming with promise. In a Devon village, a farmer named Roger led his oxen to the fields, his son at his side, their hands together on the plough. The first furrow, cut into the thawing earth, was a prayer made visible, a vow that life would endure. Villagers gathered, their voices raised in song, their faces alight with cautious joy. The worst was over. Spring was near. This resilience defined the medieval spirit. Winter was a crucible, testing body and soul, yet through it all, people clung to hope. They shared their last crust, sang through chattering teeth, and watched for spring with unyielding faith. Their legacy is a mirror to our own potential, a reminder that even in our darkest seasons, we can find light. As you sit by your modern hearth, perhaps warming your hands on a mug, think of those who faced winter with little more than courage and community. Their stories are a fire that warms us still, a testament to the unbreakable human spirit. The long night's work. Winter's demands were relentless, shaping every facet of medieval life. For the peasant, each day was a litany of tasks, each one a battle against the cold. Mornings began in darkness, the family rising from straw pallets to cokes of fire from damp wood. The mother, perhaps named Alina, would sweep the hearth, her breath clouding as she arranged kindling with care. Her husband, Godric, trudged to the barn, his boots crunching through snow to feed the livestock. The cow, its milk thin from poor fodder, lowed mournfully, while chickens huddled in their coop, too cold to lay. Feeding the animals was a delicate balance. Too much hay, and the stores would run dry. Too little, and the beasts would weaken. Godric's hands, rough from years of toil, trembled as he broke ice from the trough, his thoughts on the spring that seemed a lifetime away. Foraging was another necessity, though the frozen land offered little. Women and children scoured the woods for hardy herbs, nettles, sorrel, or wild garlic, their fingers stinging as they plucked frozen leaves. In 1394, a chronicler in Kent described a group of girls, led by a lass named Cecily, who braved a blizzard to gather pine needles for a medicinal tea. Their small haul saved a neighbor's child from fever, a quiet triumph in a season of loss. Repairing homes was equally vital. Roofs, patched with straw, often leaked, letting in snow that melted into icy puddles. Men climbed rickety ladders to stuff gaps with mud and moss, their hands numb but their resolve firm. In one Yorkshire village, a carpenter named Baldwin spent a week mending his neighbor's hovel, his hammer's rhythm a steady beat against the wind's howl. Women, too, bore a heavy burden. Spinning and weaving filled the long nights, as threadbare cloaks and blankets needed constant repair. In a 15th-century French chronicle, a weaver named Margot was praised for her skill, her loom producing cloth that warmed her village through a bitter winter. Her fingers, calloused from the shuttle, wove not just wool but hope, each thread a promise of survival. Cooking, too, was an art of ingenuity. With fresh food scarce, women turned dried peas, beans, and salted fish into stews, flavored with whatever herbs could be found. A recipe from a 14th-century English manor describes a pottage of barley, leeks, and a single precious egg, its warmth a lifeline for a hungry family. Children, though spared the heaviest labors, were not idle. They gathered twigs, fed the fire, or tended younger siblings, their small hands busy despite the cold. In a 1420 chronicle from Bavaria, a boy named Hans, no more than 10, was lauded for carrying water from a frozen stream, his bucket heavy, but his heart light with pride. These tasks, though grueling, were woven into the fabric of community. Neighbors shared tools, traded skills, and watched over each other's children, their interdependence a shield against winter's isolation. The scourge of winter's maladies, disease was winter's cruelest weapon, thriving in the close quarters, where people sought warmth. The air in hovels and castles alike was thick with smoke, and the stench of unwashed bodies, a perfect breeding ground for contagion. Influenza swept through villages, its fevered grip sparing no one. Pneumonia, born of damp and cold, turned coughs into death sentences, especially for the young and old. In 1377, a brutal winter in London saw thousands succumb to a great cough, their lungs rattled by the damp air. A chronicler wrote, "The churches are filled with mourners, their prayers drowned by hacking breaths." Medieval medicine offered little solace. Physicians, steeped in the theory of humors, prescribed bleeding or poultices of mustard and rue, often worsening the patient's plight. In 1410, a Parisian doctor named Gillis treated a noblewoman with a fever, only to see her die after a regimen of leeches and bitter tonics. Folk remedies, though sometimes kinder, were no more effective. Herbal teas might soothe a sore throat, but they could not halt pneumonia's advance. The Black Death, which struck in 1348, was particularly devastating in winter, as malnourished bodies huddled together, spreading the plague's deadly breath. In Florence, a merchant named Giovanni recorded, "The snow falls, and with it our neighbors. Entire streets lie empty, their doors sealed by fear." Yet, amidst this suffering, acts of courage emerged. In a 1349 convent near Avignon, a nun named Sister Claire risked her life to nurse plague victims, her hand steady as she cleaned sores and whispered prayers. Her chronicle, preserved in the convent's library, speaks of a duty to God and man, to hold fast even as death surrounds us. Monks, too, played their part, turning monasteries into makeshift hospitals. In 1403, A Cistercian monk named Brother Anselm in Cologne spent weeks tending the sick, his robes stained with their suffering. "Each life saved is a candle lit," he wrote, his words a testament to the resilience that burned even in winter's darkest hours. The elderly and children were especially vulnerable. Infants, born into the cold, faced grim odds. Some estimates suggest a third did not survive their first winter. Mothers, weakened by hunger, struggled to nurse, their milk thin and fleeting. In 1360, a chronicle from Norwich tells of a mother named Agnes, who wrapped her newborn in her own cloak, sacrificing her warmth to keep the child alive. Both survived, a miracle celebrated in the village's church. The elderly, their bones aching from years of toil, often succumbed to the cold, their bodies found stiff by morning. Yet, communities rallied to protect them. In a 15th-century German village, a group of youths took turns bringing firewood to an old man named Otto, his gratitude a warmth that rivaled the flames. The light of festivals. Festivals were winter's antidote, moments of joy that pierced the gloom. The Feast of St. Stephen, celebrated on December 26th, was a crown jewel of the season, a day when the rigid feudal order dissolved in laughter and revelry. A peasant, perhaps a cheeky lad named Tom, might be crowned lord of misrule, his mock scepter waving as he ordered knights to juggle or ladies to dance. In a 1425 chronicle from Devon, a lord of misrule named will led a procession through the snow, his command sparking peals of laughter as a dour reeve was made to sing a love ballad. Mummers, their faces painted with charcoal, performed skits of saints and devils, their antics drawing cheers from bundled crowds. Tables groaned with roasted meats, spiced cakes, and wassail bowls, their steam rising like a prayer. Candlemas, on February 2nd, brought another burst of light. Churches glowed with tapers, each one blessed to ward off evil. In a 1430 Yorkshire village, a priest named Father Simon led his flock in a candlelit procession, their voices singing psalms as snow fell softly around them. "The light endures," he said, his words a beacon for weary hearts. Wassailing, too, was a cherished rite. Villagers gathered in orchards, their breath clouding as they sang to apple trees, pouring cider onto frozen roots. In 1460, a Somerset chronicler described a wassail night where the fires blazed, and the songs woke the stars, as if spring herself were listening. These celebrations were more than merriment, they were acts of defiance, proof that winter could not extinguish joy. In one Cheshire village, a 14th-century mumming play saw a blacksmith play St. George, his hammer wielded as a sword to slay a straw dragon, to the delight of children. Such moments stitched communities together, their laughter a thread stronger than the cold. The stirring of spring. As winter waned, the first signs of spring were a miracle to behold. Snowdrops and crocuses, delicate yet fierce, pushed through the frost, their colors a promise of life. The days grew longer, their light softer but stronger, warming faces that had forgotten the sun's touch. Plough Monday, the first Monday after Epiphany, marked the land's rebirth. Ploughs, polished and garlanded, were paraded through villages, their blades gleaming with hope. In a 1415 Norfolk hamlet, a farmer named Henry led his oxen to the fields, his daughter Alice scattering seeds at his side. The first furrow, cut into the thawing earth, was a vow that life would endure. Villagers gathered, their songs rising like larks, their faces alight with joy. The return of spring was more than a season, it was a triumph. Families emerged from their hovels, leaner and wearier but alive. Children ran through muddy lanes, their laughter a hymn to survival. In one Kent village, a grandmother named Etheldreda, her hands gnarled from years of toil, taught her grandchildren to plant peas, her voice soft with memory. "This is how we live," she said, "through winter's dark to spring's light." The earth, softened by the sun, welcomed their seeds, each one a prayer for abundance. This cycle of endurance and renewal defined the medieval spirit. Winter tested every soul, from the king in his drafty hall to the child in her tattered shawl. Yet through famine, frost, and fever, they held fast. Their legacy humbles us, reminding us of our own capacity to endure. As you sit by your modern hearth, think of those who faced winter with little more than courage and community. Their stories are fire that warms us still, a testament to the unbreakable human spirit. May you dream of fields green with hope, and may spring always find you.